Okay, it is now my distinct honor to introduce today's keynote. Ken Starr served as independent counsel investigating the Clinton administration from 1994 to 1999. His legal career also includes service as Solicitor General of the United States under President George H.W. Bush, a federal court appeals judge nominated by President Ronald Reagan, and law clerk to Supreme Court Chief Justice Warren Burger. He served as president of Baylor University from 2010 to 2016 and as dean of the Pepperdine School of Law from 2004 to 2010. After his presentation, Ken will be personalizing copies of his New York Times best-selling book, Contempt, which will be for sale in the lobby. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ken Starr.
Oh my gosh. Honestly, that was great. Thank you. Thank you, Madam President, and thank you all for coming. It's a great honor to be here with such, and I know a lot of you, which has been so pleasant to be in Palm Beach County, now West Palm Beach, over these last 18 hours. And Pastor, thank you for great is thy faithfulness. Now I want you to all join me. Don't know, he's going to sing his speech. No, I'm not. Ready? My country, 'tis of thee. Oh, the choir is here. In the spirit of the sweet land of liberty, would my dear friend Horst Solbach rise, a great American patriot who escaped as a young man from East Germany under remarkable circumstances and has made his life and career in the sweet land of liberty. Would my dear friend Ambassador Diego Asuncio please stand up, an American hero. Where's Diego? Held captive. Ambassador to several countries, we worked collaboratively together. Dean John Guerin, my friend from the Legal Academy. Here he is from Nova Southeastern. One of my many lawyer friends, Mike Madigan from the great town of Washington, D.C. Mike, did you go away? And he did, he left. And then my good friend and fellow Baylor Bear, Vincent Harris, a genius working around the world on various and sundry political campaigns for the good of democracy. Well, my theme really is this sweet land of liberty, because at the founding, wait, I didn't acknowledge again the high school students. Would you, another round of applause for the high school students and their sponsors. You know, at the founding, the 55 delegates to Philadelphia focused their attention on structural issues, because to them, structure, the architecture of government, was at the heart of American liberty. And thus they, of course, gave us the great principles. They didn't invent them, but they said, here they are for your consideration, of separation of powers and of federalism, that we are the United States of America. One time, a very eminent diplomat from Mexico, our wonderful neighbor to the south, said, you have a fundamental problem in your country, and that is you don't have a name. I said, yes, we do. We're the United States of America. He said, no, that's a description. I said, but it works for us, Your Excellency, because that really is who we are. Oh, yes, we're in a time of division, but do you recall there was a thing called the Civil War? Do you recall a period, most of you don't, the 1960s? Friends, division is just a part of who we are. And so these two principles of our federal government and of our national republic, and remember Dr. Franklin's magnificent words as he, the only octogenarian in Philadelphia for the convention, and he insisted, even though he was suffering from various and sundry maladies of old age, especially old age at that time, and when he leaves what we now call Independence Hall, he was asked, what kind of constitution, what kind of government have you given us, Dr. Franklin? Some of you will recall his response. Dr. Franklin replied, Did you notice? Okay. This is a very smart part of the room. Now, for this part of the room, just kidding. A republic, comma, but it was a contingent. It was a republic that we're giving you for your consideration. We're not imposing it. You're going to have a great debate. And there will be, hopefully, ratification. But even if there's ratification, if you can keep it. And part of keeping it is not simply then listening, as Mr. Madison did, to the voices of those who are concerned about the aggregation of power and the lack of a Bill of Rights. We know that story, right? That Colonel Mason, who Jefferson dubbed the wisest person of our generation, George Mason, they finally named a university after him. George Mason walks out of the convention politely but firmly, so he was part of the resistance. And he became part of the resistance in his beloved Commonwealth of Virginia. And he had a very powerful ally, the most eloquent man on at least our part of the planet, Patrick Henry, who wouldn't go to Philadelphia because, quote, I smell. I heard it over here again. Come on, guys. Let's go. I smell a rat. He was very concerned about this aggregation of power. So how do we hold government at the federal level accountable? Which brings me to a dark day in American history. No, not the day that I was appointed. I'll get there. They didn't even laugh on this side of the This is a very serious part of the audience. By the way, I noticed that all the elected officials over on this side of the room. No wonder you're so congenial and gather, Madam Mayor and so forth. That dark night we have come to call the Saturday Night Massacre. Who got fired in the Saturday Night Massacre? Archibald Cox. Oh, this side of the room is there. Archibald Cox. Archibald Cox had been appointed as special prosecutor, the name's changed, as special prosecutor to investigate what? Watergate. So the President of the United States, or does this sound, are there some echoes?
Yeah,
We're getting there. That's good because I'm 5 minutes into my talk and I only have 22 minutes in all, not to go. And so, what happened when President Nixon gave the order? Remember Harry Truman? Harry Truman said famously, I give orders as the commander-in-chief and nothing happens. Has anyone read a certain book about a certain president of the United States? But let's leave that aside. That didn't get any chuckles at all, so we'll let that one go. So he orders the firing of Archibald Cox because, and if you go back in time and you look at it from the president's perspective, the president had a point. He had offered a compromise with respect to the review of the Oval Office tapes, that in the interests of privacy, as well as relevancy, the charge was, of course, that the President of the United States had engaged, at least for a period of time, in obstruction of justice. Unfortunately, that turned out to be true. But there was going to be then an inquiry, a grand jury inquiry into all this. And so what do we do with these White House tapes? And President Nixon said, here is my alternative. Here is a United States senator, a respected United States senator from the other party, who will personally review the tapes. I know the exercise. I had to review all the diaries of Senator Bob Packwood of Oregon. Yeah, it can be done. I mean, it's an undertaking, but it can be done. And Archibald Cox said, no, I want the best evidence. Perfectly reasonable response. But to President Nixon and his team, that was unreasonable. And so when the loggerheads came, President Nixon directed the firing. But the Attorney General said, I cannot in conscience fire Archibald Cox, given the representations I've made to the United States Senate. He had also made representations as well to the United States House of Representatives, and so he resigned. You know, there's an honor in resigning. There might even be honor in being fired, depending on the circumstances, and I think Archibald Cox is lifted up, rightly so, as a man of honor and integrity. Yes, he was pretty bullheaded about that one particular issue, but he was exercising his professional judgment, determined to stay the course, and so the United States Attorney General said, I cannot fire him. I resign. The Deputy Attorney General, second in command, then said, I too made similar representations as a matter of honor during my own confirmation hearings and other conversations. I can't fire him. There's a third person in the room, and I can see that back office. It's a small office on the 5th floor of the Justice Department. And I know this happened. I've had eyewitness reports. All of the eyewitnesses are dead. That was not funny. No. But death does come. And the two, now I can't do this, I can't fire Cox, said, Bob, you have to do it. Bob was the then Solicitor General of the United States, Robert Bork. Some people march on stage and they leave the stage, and then in another act they come back. Because Judge Bork had not made, future Judge Bork, any representation. And so he fired Cox. But he did something very important. He then issued a set of regulations under which he appointed a new special prosecutor. And that new set of regulations said, this new prosecutor will not be fired without prior consultation with 4 enumerated members of the legislative branch. Comity, working in our separation of powers system collaboratively. And thus, Leon Jaworski, great lawyer, former president of the American Bar Association, and most importantly, a double Baylor graduate. That's what they were looking for all along. And so the rest is history. The resignation of the president in the face of articles of impeachment being drafted in the House of Representatives. That all happened in the early 1970s. But then elections have consequences. And in 1976, not only did the people say no to Gerald Ford, perfectly honorable man, but they welcomed an outsider. And the outsider said to the American people during the campaign, James Earl Carter, I will never lie to you. A man of decency, honor, integrity. And so he comes to Washington, D.C., and he urges Congress to do that which Congress was eager to do. Don't allow the Saturday night massacre to ever happen again. And so Congress passed what were then called the special prosecutor provisions of the Ethics in Government Act. They came to be known as the independent counsel provisions. My friends, it was under that statute, which existed for 21 years, that your humble correspondent today was appointed. The Supreme Court of the United States upheld the constitutionality of the independent counsel provisions with its unusual appointment provisions. You see, in contrast to Archibald Cox and Leon Jaworski, who were appointed by the Attorney General of the United States or the acting Attorney General of the United States, I was appointed by 3 judges. Think of that. Why would a prosecutor who's investigating the president, those around the president, be appointed by 3 appellate judges from around the country? Because Congress wanted to take the appointment power out of the hands of the executive branch. And now, an eerie echo of what's happening in the midterms. Congress not only took that power from the executive and placed it in the judiciary, an anomalous structure, but it did something that proved to be historically ill-conceived. It created an engine and a dynamic pointing toward impeachment. You see, the impeachment that unfolded, and which I describe in the book, unfolded because of an act of Congress in 1978. here was the standard. We're all going to go to law school just for a second, but don't worry, it's going to be very brief. It may be painful, but it's going to be very brief. The independent counsel is to report or refer to Congress, to the House of Representatives, whenever any, here's your law school, substantial and credible information that an impeachable offense may have been committed. A fairly light threshold or light trigger. An even lighter trigger required the Attorney General to appoint or to seek the appointment from the three-judge court of an independent counsel. The regulations under which Robert Mueller was appointed by Deputy Attorney General, Acting Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, have been purified of any inter-branch attack. That is, Bob Mueller is not to provide the House of Representatives with an impeachment report. In fact, when you go to the regulations, and they're very easy for anyone to understand, I just reread them about 48 hours ago, just to be sure. They haven't changed. By the way, the regulations were first promulgated by Attorney General Janet Reno in the last, Floridian, in the last year of the Clinton, and they've stood the test of time. And Mueller, Bob Mueller, in whom I have great confidence, I've served with him in the administration of President Bush 41, a man of integrity. And he has been appointed under a regulatory regime that honors the separation of powers principle that I think the Congress of the United States, in its desire to prevent one specific thing, the Saturday Night Massacre, then created this entire elaborate apparatus. Reform. Reminds me of the story that's told by a backbencher in Commons who had served in Commons but was not in the cabinet. And someone from the other side stands up and is proposing reform, and the backbencher stands up, as they do in the Commons, and says, "Reform? Reform? Don't speak to this body about reform. Things are bad enough as they are." Sometimes it's better to leave things alone and to go back to the untidy administration of Ulysses S. Grant. You see, the history of special counsels, we now call them, or special prosecutors of independent counsels, began with General Grant. Chapter 37 of Ron Chernow's magnificent biography of General Grant discusses the specifics of the so-called whiskey ring. There was, in fact, skullduggery afoot. There were crimes being committed by virtue of what was called the whiskey ring, arising out of wrongdoing and corruption in the federal government in St. Louis. President Grant himself made the decision, when this matter is going to be investigated, it's not going to be investigated by officers who I appointed. It's going to be appointed, and he named him a political opponent. You see, I want someone who will operate without fear or a concern about favor. So General Grant, of the party of Lincoln, the grand old party, a Republican, says we must name someone from the opposite party, from Andy Jackson's party. And so a Democratic former senator from Missouri, lawyer, was named as special prosecutor for Whiskey Ring. You see, that is, with the exception of Teapot Dome, we won't go into Teapot Dome, talk to me afterwards, but Teapot Dome is the exception that proves the rule, because there the Senate got into the act, and the Senate joined collaboratively with President Coolidge to appoint two special prosecutors, independent counsels, special counsels, one a Republican and one a Democrat. Now, that's kind of a sensible way to do it, isn't it? Let's have a bipartisan investigation, not simply look to the other party. But we departed from that apparatus during those 21 years with the independent counsel statute, and we've returned. There's been, as it were, a restoration. We've jettisoned the reform, and almost unanimously, there were a few exceptions, But when I testified, and I describe this in the book, when I testified in April of 1999 that the statute should be allowed to expire and not be reauthorized, one of the senators on the committee, the Senate Committee on Government Operations, was incredulous. He was polite. You've perhaps heard of him, Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois. Very able person. He said, I find it odd that you, of all people, would be urging that we permit the statute to expire. That was my testimony. I said, Senator, I understand what you might think is the case, but what is actually the case is that there was opposition to this section of the law from the very beginning, from both Republicans and Democrats, because of the concerns about separation of powers, and also because of the concerns of this engine toward impeachment. Get that engine revved up and get the House of Representatives bestirred, and let's have division and rancor in the country. And one of the things that I say with truly echoes of the present time, impeachment is by its very nature a wrenching and searing national experience. Even if, and I put before you the proposition that President Clinton was guilty of crimes against the rule of law. Many of you in this room will not like hearing that, but the facts are the facts. And the name of the book, which may seem to be unkind, comes from the fact that President Clinton stands as the only president in the history of our republic, thank goodness, who has been held in contempt for his violations of the rule of law by a United States District Judge in his home district of the Eastern District of Arkansas. A sad tale. But even with that, the nation said no to impeachment. And part of the message that comes out of this, the echo for today is, unless there is a bipartisan consensus that impeachment and removal from office is in fact the way to go, please don't go there. You're simply going to tear the country apart. Not that it hasn't been torn apart before, but it's... And so I close with this recollection of Dick Durbin, who was, again, very polite, he's a very able person. And I said, Senator, you were not in the Senate at the time, but a little over a decade ago, there was a junior officer of the Department of Justice who testified before this committee, before the Senate Judiciary Committee, for the House Judiciary Committee, urging the Congress of the United States not to continue the independent counsel law or the special prosecutor provisions of the 1978 Ethics in Government Act. That officer who stood right here, or who sat right here, and urged you not to do it was the then Associate Attorney General of the United States, Rudy Giuliani. Some people just keep walking on the stage, don't they? And so I close with, God bless this sweet land of liberty, the sweet land that Diego Asensio bravely served and nearly lost his life in the service of our country, and that Horst Solbach, leaving East Germany with his father on the train going into West Berlin from the east, tapping on the train floor, because underneath the train, holding onto the train, was 16-year-old Horst Solbach, seeking a life in a sweet land of liberty. God bless America, and God bless this wonderful forum. Thank you very much.
guys. Is the mic on? There we go. Thank you. Mr. Starr, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And Ken, today's questions will come directly from our audience. This is our opportunity as citizen leaders to hear news and information directly from the source in an unfiltered format. To kick off our Q&A, we begin with 2 questions from our students. As we mentioned earlier, often the toughest questions from the group.
Where's my lawyer when I need her?
That's right. Where did Mike go? If the first student from Palm Beach Central High School will please stand, introduce yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Good morning, Good morning, Mr. Starr. My name is Dominic Flame, and I'm from the Palm Beach Central High School debate team. May I ask the question?
Oh, yes, please.
Sorry.
Continue.
While working on the Starr Report, then lawyer Brett Kavanaugh pressed for aggressive questioning of President Clinton regarding his relationship with Monica Lewinsky. But when Judge Kavanaugh was recently questioned by the Senate Judicial Committee about alleged accusations raised against him, he criticized the unfairness of the proceedings. What should the standard be for those who seek our government's highest posts?
I think that's ultimately a question for the American people, but I do believe that we expect rock-ribbed integrity, honesty, freedom from any form of corruption or mendacity. And so I will go ahead and say I think that should be the standard. And so you didn't ask this, Dominic, but I'll go ahead and say it. I worked with Brett Kavanaugh for many years, and I have total confidence in his integrity.
Thank you. If those of you in the audience have a question card that you would like to hold up, our volunteers will bring it forward. And now if the second student from Palm Beach Central High School will please stand, introduce yourself, and ask your question.
Good morning, Mr. Starr. My name is Brianna Garcon, and I am from the Palm Beach Central debate team. And my question is as follows. While president and chancellor of Baylor University, a lawsuit alleged that players of the very successful football team sexually assaulted multiple women on campus. Head coach Art Briles was fired, and you resigned as a result. Given the national conversation on the Me Too movement, what specific steps would you take if in that same situation today?
Well, I wrote a book on this subject, so thank you, Brianna, for asking that question. And I would like to get her mailing address because I'd like to give her a copy of the book. I don't have one with me. Obviously, the issue of sexual violence, sexual harassment, Title IX in all of our institutions of learning is a profoundly serious matter. I'm, what shall I say, able to say that I had no knowledge of the various and sundry allegations. And I think there is no evidence that I did have knowledge, that somehow you were sitting on information. As I say in Title IX of my, Chapter 9, but appropriate in light of Title IX, from my very beginning at Baylor University, I took steps to ensure student safety generally, and including complying with Title IX as interpreted by the Department of Education. There's now been a recalibration of those, but I think what it really kind of boils down to is this. Greater sensitivity on the part of all of us, not just college presidents, but I was very pleased to see that a student initiative, complete with T-shirts, which made it official, it's on us. Because too many of the episodes occurred, first of all, off campus, secondly, involving a party situation, and thirdly, circumstances where third-party intervention might very well have been efficacious. I think there was a sense that we don't just want to allow bad things to happen to people who we know are friends or otherwise. And so I commend to you the common sense of Chapter 9 of my book, Bear Country, The Baylor Story.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
She's going to be a great debater, or probably is a great debater.
Yeah. Chuck, if you can get her contact info, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
All right.
I have plenty of copies left over. It did not make the New York Times bestseller list.
But all Baylor alumni associations get copies?
Absolutely. Anyone who is a Baylor Bear or knows a Baylor Bear should.
All
Well, maybe
right.
they should go to Amazon. But Brianna goes to Uncle Ken.
Thank you. Okay, question number 1. In November, the A&E network will have a it's tough to read handwriting sometimes. Yes, will air a 6-part documentary exploring President Clinton's impeachment as, quote, the origins of today's political chicanery and tribalism, unquote. Is there any way to return to the days of political compromise, or is partisan politics so firmly entrenched as to make the middle ground politically unsafe?
My own theory is that it's a matter of leadership. That if we want leaders who will say, in the spirit of LBJ, one of his favorite quotes from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 1 was, "Come, let us reason together." But unless people are willing to come together and have a respectful dialogue and the like, then it will not happen. So I lament the fact that there are actually calls for incivility, that incivility is good coming from elected leaders. And I think if we, the people, say, regardless of my politics, I don't approve of that, I don't applaud that, I'm going to stand up and condemn it. And I will say that to anticipate that there may be questions, but in the event that there is not, with respect to the tone that the president sets. I've said in an op-ed, I said it in July of last year, and the headline in the Washington Post is, "Mr. President, cut it out." That even those who approve wholeheartedly of much of his policies want him to be less divisive. And so I think as a matter of leadership, from everyone who's in elected office, let us kind of come and reason together, discuss our differences, and try to iron them out.
Given your comments regarding the special prosecutor regulations, which affirm the separation of powers doctrine, how do you feel about the assertions by President Trump that he has the power to fire Robert Mueller?
In my view, the president does have the power to fire Bob Mueller. Bob Mueller is, my friends came alive over here. And he has the power to fire, to direct the firing of Bob Mueller. At a minimum, he has that power. I believe he has the power just to issue the order, and that's it. He has the power, as the President of the United States, to remove any executive branch officer who's not protected by civil service regulations, and my friend Bob Mueller is not, nor is my former colleague from Whitewater, Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General. So he does have the power, the authority to do that. I'll go ahead and answer somewhat gratuitously that I think would be, and I've said this in editorials and in various interviews, a grievous error of judgment on the part of the president to do either of those. He should allow the investigation simply to run its course. Bob Mueller was properly appointed by Rod Rosenstein and has a grant of authority, and we should just see that through, and hopefully it will be through as soon as possible.
Thank you. Back when you were investigating President Clinton, he called the investigation a witch hunt. President Trump has called the Russia investigation a witch hunt. Is he right?
I don't think either president, with all due respect, was correct. I do not think that what's underway now is a witch hunt. And I've said that many times publicly. It's a duly authorized investigation. And I was very pleased to see in recent weeks that Rod Rosenstein and the president flew together to Florida. They apparently had a 45-minute conversation aboard Air Force One, and Rod has not been fired. Rod I know to be a person of total integrity. I worked with him in the investigation. He was on the original trial team in Little Rock, Arkansas. So I've worked very closely with the much younger Rod Rosenstein, but he went on to have a fabulous record as a United States attorney, supported by the Democratic senators from his state, Paul Sarbanes at the time and Barbara Mikulski at the time. So, no. With respect to the call, and I talk a lot about this in the book, it did not give me pleasure for us to find so much criminality in Little Rock. Criminality that we believe involved the President of the United States. Come to your own view, but I think the evidence is overwhelming that the President was, in fact, involved in chicanery in Little Rock. But we did not bring charges based upon his Little Rock or Arkansas generally activity. But there were, alas, 14 criminal convictions, including a very hard-fought 3-month jury trial. And the President and the then First Lady, the Secretary of State Clinton's business partners, Susan McDougal and Jim McDougal, were convicted by a Little Rock jury of serious felonies. They both were sent to prison because of that. And so I think the record would suggest that, unfortunately, there was a good deal of criminality in Arkansas, and I discussed this in some detail.
The White House counsel, Don McGahn, is said to have cooperated with the Mueller investigation in at least 3 voluntary interviews with investigators for over 30 hours. Solomon Weisenberg, a deputy counsel under you during the Whitewater investigation, remarked, quote, "Oh my God, it would have been phenomenally helpful, like having the keys to the kingdom," unquote. Give us your take on perhaps what that motivation or strategy is for that action.
Well, notwithstanding the music coming out of the White House, I'm reminded of what was said of Wagner's music. It's better than it sounds. The White House cooperated fully, from everything we've been able to see, with the Mueller investigation. Now, the point of conflict has come on the President's personal appearance and so forth, and I view that as a very serious question. But has there, in fact, been a pattern or practice of trying to impede or obstruct the investigation? As I chronicle in the book, that's what we faced with the Clinton White House. Mendacity in the Clinton White House. With respect to invocation of executive privilege, with respect to the creation of a phantom privilege called the protective function privilege for the lawyers and judges in the room. You might very well ask, what is that? Well, it is non-existent. It was simply invented as a way to slow our investigation down. I know of no evidence that, notwithstanding his many comments, many of which are intemperate, that the President has in fact cooperated with the investigation. There's an irony here, right? Strikes me as ironic.
The Kavanaugh confirmation process was extremely contentious. Give us your opinion on the process.
Well, Brett, Justice Kavanaugh referred to it as a national disgrace. I would call it a national tragedy. So many norms of fairness and procedural due process were offended. And I frankly can't get over 2 things. One, that I know and love Brett Kavanaugh and work with him closely for so many years, and know his reputation among those who have worked with him over these decades, including his 12 years of service as a judge. And so the allegation was just so out of character. And I'm not saying bad things didn't happen to Dr. Ford. I credit that her testimony that something really horrible happened. But the question is identification. And I will say this, I've been involved for a number of years with the Innocence Project. We have to be very assiduous in our country to pay attention to basic norms of fairness. Because I have had a conversation eye to eye in my work on capital punishment issues with a woman in California who languished on death row for family murders that she did not commit. But the witnesses were sure. The prosecutor was sure, but she was exonerated by DNA. Almost every month, there's another story of an innocent person who was not some legal technicality, factually and morally innocent, was convicted after a full trial with appeals and the like, and yet that person didn't commit the crime. So can't we at least say, we want to listen and make sure that we get this right. And yes, I know this is not a trial. You immediately say you're mixing apples and oranges because this is Senate confirmation. And so the last thing I'll say is I was distressed that Senator Feinstein had the information anonymously in early July and chose, for whatever reason, maybe people here know the reason, not to bring the information forward in a timely manner. And I think that was unfair to the Senate. I think it was eventually unfair to the Supreme Court of the United States. I was pleased, I'll get to the happy part of the story, that to show this unity of purpose, what Brett called, I'm a team player and I'm a member of a team. And he's already showing that in the first week of his service, now into his second week of service, in various ways that won't make the newspapers, but he's showing. But one of the things that was so powerful, I think, to the country to say this is a rule of law is that at the ceremonial swearing in at the White House were all of his 8 colleagues. So there's Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who probably didn't vote for President Trump, right? Stephen Breyer, Elena Kagan, and Sonia Sotomayor, but they rallied around. I think I'd like to see more rallying around in this country and less tearing apart.
Thank you. So Ken, Rod Rosenstein was actually here and spoke before the Forum Club last January, and we would welcome a good word from you to Justice Kavanaugh so that we might have him in the future.
Right.
Yesterday, I couldn't help it. Yesterday,
I think I just got an assignment.
Secretary Clinton yesterday stated in an interview that President Clinton's extramarital affair with an intern was not an abuse of power. Based on your investigation, how would you respond to Secretary Clinton today?
Well, I think it's understandable that she would be defensive of her spouse, but leaving the morality aside of the relationship, that's for individuals to come forward with their judgment based upon their worldview, philosophy, what animates them and inspires them to high norms of behavior. The fundamental issue, I think, is being captured these days by the question of power. And no one has denied, certainly Monica has never denied there was a consensual relationship, but she was young and she was an intern. So I would think that the better way of approaching it would be what Fiorello LaGuardia would say when he had really done something really not very good. And that was, he said, when I make a mistake, it's a beaut, right? So when Dick Morris did his famous poll, I recount this, when the story broke about the relationship, Dick Morris did an overnight poll. For those of you who don't know, is a very influential political advisor to President Clinton, among others, and a brilliant guy. He's largely faded from everyday participation on the political scene, but extremely brilliant guy. And so he did an overnight poll, and he reports back to the president that the American people will forgive adultery, but they will not forgive perjury. Well, you see, the president already committed perjury. That's a problem. And so, according to Dick Morris, uncontradicted testimony, what the president of the United States then said, well, we will just have to win then.
So this will be our last question, but for those of you that have your books and wish to have them personalized, Ken will be out in the lobby for after we're done for book signing. As a child, you would play in your room for hours moving wooden clothespins around. Your mother, who lived to be 91, archived them in a box for you, mystified by their significance. What did those clothespins represent, and do you still have them?
I do not have them, shame on me, but they were lawyers engaged in vigorous debate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Starr.
You're great.
You need every piece
We'll
of
look
stuff.
forward to seeing everyone on November 26th. Thank you.